The funniest jokes have a dangerous habit of becoming permanent memories. At least, that was what I kept thinking as I stared across our cramped apartment at Jason Cole, who had somehow turned a lazy Saturday afternoon into the strangest conversation of my life. The sink overflowed with dirty dishes, unfolded laundry covered half the couch, and 3 empty pizza boxes leaned against the kitchen counter like they had become permanent decorations. Jason stretched lazily across the recliner, looked at his older brother with complete confidence, and announced, "Take Liam for 3 months. I get 3 months without housework, and everybody wins." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Jason laughed because he always laughed at his own jokes. The only person who remained completely serious was Nathan Hayes. He stood near the apartment door wearing a navy jacket over a crisp white shirt, his posture relaxed but composed, quietly observing the disaster that Jason and I had somehow accepted as normal. His calm gray eyes drifted from the overflowing trash can to the stack of unpaid utility bills before finally settling on me. "Would you consider moving into my guest room for a while?" he asked. The laughter disappeared instantly. "You cannot be serious," I replied. "I am," Nathan answered without hesitation. Jason slowly sat upright. "Hold on. I was joking." Nathan nodded. "I know. You are actually offering?" "Yes." Jason looked at me with wide eyes. I did not expect this part. Neither did I. I had met Nathan only a handful of times over the past year whenever he stopped by to help Jason with something practical, usually fixing a broken appliance or dropping off groceries because Jason had forgotten to shop again. He always seemed calm, polite, and impossible to annoy. Standing there in our cluttered apartment, he looked completely out of place, like someone who belonged in a different world. "Why?" I finally asked. Nathan thought for a moment before answering. "Because everyone deserves to come home to a place where they can rest." The simplicity of the answer caught me off guard. There was no sales pitch, no strange condition, no awkward joke. Just quiet. Sincerity. Jason rubbed the back of his neck. "This is officially the weirdest conversation I have ever started." Nathan ignored him. "There is no pressure, Liam. If you say no, nothing changes." I glanced around the apartment. The ceiling stain above the dining table had grown larger after last week's rainstorm. The old refrigerator hummed loudly enough to compete with the television. Jason had promised for 6 months that he would organize the living room and had somehow made it even messier instead. I smiled despite myself. "Hypothetically," I said, "what would living with you be like?" Nathan's expression softened just enough to reveal the hint of a smile. "Quiet mornings. Shared dinners if you would like company. Your own room. Complete privacy. And one very friendly golden retriever who believes everyone exists to throw tennis balls." That last part sounds convincing, I admitted. Jason pointed dramatically toward his brother. "See? He bribed you with a dog." Nathan finally smiled. It was not intentional. We all laughed together, and for a brief moment the apartment felt lighter than it had in months. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and placed a simple business card on the coffee table. "Take your time. Think about it. Call me only if it feels like the right decision." He gave Jason a brief nod before quietly leaving. After the apartment door closed, the room fell strangely silent. Jason stared at the business card as though it might suddenly explain everything. "You are not actually thinking about this, are you?" he asked. I picked up the card and turned it over in my hands. It contained only Nathan's name, his phone number, and the logo of his architecture firm. Nothing more. No promises. No expectations. Just an open door. 3 nights later, after another cold shower caused by our unreliable water heater and another evening listening to the upstairs neighbors argue through paper-thin walls, I stood alone on the apartment balcony with my phone in one hand and Nathan's card in the other. Before I could change my mind, I dialed the number. He answered after the second ring. "Good evening, Liam," he said warmly. "I was hoping you would call." Nathan arrived the following afternoon exactly when he said he would. His dark SUV pulled quietly into the parking lot outside our aging apartment building, while Jason stood beside me holding one of my suitcases with an expression that shifted between guilt and disbelief. "I cannot believe my joke actually worked," Jason muttered. "You should probably stop saying that before I change my mind," I replied. Nathan stepped out of the vehicle carrying the same calm confidence he seemed to bring everywhere. Instead of immediately reaching for my luggage, he looked at me first. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. The question surprised me. Most people assumed a decision was final once boxes were packed. Nathan wanted to know whether it was still my decision. Yes, I answered after a brief pause. I am. Only then did he lift my suitcase into the back of the vehicle. The drive across town was peaceful. We talked about ordinary things instead of awkward ones. Nathan recommended a small bakery that made fresh cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning and pointed out a quiet park where people gathered to read beneath old maple trees. By the time we turned onto a tree-lined street filled with well-kept homes and colorful gardens, I realized I no longer felt nervous. I felt curious. Nathan's house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by flowering shrubs and tall oak trees. Before he even unlocked the front door, a golden retriever happily pushed it open from the inside and bounded toward us with unstoppable enthusiasm. That must be the famous tennis ball expert. I laughed as the dog happily circled around me. Nathan smiled. His name is Oliver, and he has already decided you belong here. Oliver gently placed a worn tennis ball at my feet, as if confirming the introduction himself. The inside of the house felt warm rather than luxurious. Bookshelves filled one wall of the living room. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. Soft instrumental music drifted from hidden speakers while sunlight poured through wide windows overlooking the backyard. It felt less like walking into someone else's house and more like stepping into a place that had quietly been waiting for company. Nathan carried my suitcase upstairs and opened the second bedroom. Large windows overlooked the garden where Oliver had already resumed his endless search for squirrels. A neatly made bed, an empty bookshelf, a reading chair beside the window, and a handwritten card rested on the desk. Welcome, Liam. I hope this house gives you the peace you deserve. There is no rush to unpack. Dinner will be ready at 6 if you would like to join me. Nathan. I read the note twice before carefully placing it back where I found it. You wrote this? I asked. Nathan nodded. Starting somewhere new is easier when someone remembers you are a guest before you become comfortable. Something about that sentence stayed with me. It sounded less like hospitality and more like experience. At exactly 6 o'clock, the smell of homemade vegetable soup filled the kitchen. We shared dinner while Oliver rested beneath the table hoping for crumbs that never came. After we finished eating, Nathan opened a nearby drawer and removed a neatly folded sheet of paper. There is one tradition I should explain, he said. I smiled. House rules. Something like that. I unfolded the page expecting strict instructions, but the first lines simply read, respect each other's quiet. Always ask before assuming. Share meals whenever you wish, never because you feel obligated. Each rule sounded thoughtful rather than controlling. When I reached the final line, I stopped reading. It simply said, this door should only ever close behind someone who freely chooses to leave. I slowly looked up at Nathan, suddenly realizing that beneath the peaceful routine and quiet kindness, this house was protecting a story I had not yet been invited to hear. The first week passed with a quiet rhythm that felt almost impossible to explain. Every morning Nathan left for his architecture firm at exactly 7:30 after brewing fresh coffee and making sure Oliver had eaten breakfast. Every morning, I walked to the neighborhood bookstore where I worked, enjoying peaceful streets lined with maple trees instead of the constant traffic outside my old apartment. By the end of each day, I found myself looking forward to returning to a place that already felt strangely familiar. Living with Nathan was completely different from living with Jason. Jason believed organization was something people talked about, but never actually practiced. Nathan believed every object deserved a purpose and every routine deserved consistency. On my third morning, I unloaded the dishwasher and unknowingly placed every coffee mug in the wrong cabinet. Nathan quietly moved them back while smiling to himself. You noticed? I asked. Only because I have reached for those mugs in the same place every morning for 5 years, he answered. I promise I am not criticizing your system. It is our system now, he replied gently. That simple sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. Little by little, the house began creating routines that belonged to both of us. Nathan discovered that I always read before bed, no matter how tired I felt. Without mentioning it, he started leaving a small reading lamp switched on beside the living room chair every evening because he knew I preferred finishing one more chapter before sleeping. I noticed he often skipped lunch whenever work became busy, So I quietly began packing an extra sandwich into his briefcase whenever I saw an early meeting written on the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Neither of us mentioned these small acts of kindness. Somehow they became our ordinary language. Saturday mornings quickly became my favorite. Nathan drove us to the bakery he had recommended, and Oliver happily greeted nearly every person we passed, as though he considered the entire neighborhood part of his extended family. We carried fresh cinnamon rolls to a nearby park where children played while older couples walked beneath the colorful autumn trees. Nathan rarely spoke during those mornings, yet the silence beside him never felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, the kind of silence that only existed when nobody felt pressured to become someone else. One rainy afternoon, I returned home early because the bookstore lost electricity during a thunderstorm. I stepped inside expecting an empty house, only to discover Nathan standing in the kitchen surrounded by flour, measuring cups, and a recipe book opened across the counter. "Please tell me you are winning," I said, trying not to laugh. Nathan looked at the uneven loaf of bread resting inside a baking pan before shaking his head. "The bread appears to disagree." I laughed so hard that Oliver immediately ran into the kitchen carrying his favorite tennis ball, convinced another game had begun. Nathan finally laughed too, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his usually reserved expression into something unexpectedly youthful. We spent the next hour cleaning flour from the countertops while the bread baked into something that looked slightly crooked but smelled wonderful. That evening we ate thick slices covered with butter while rain tapped softly against the windows. It was one of the happiest ordinary evenings I could remember. Just as I began believing life might continue peacefully forever, Nathan's phone buzzed across the table. He looked at the screen, and the warmth quietly disappeared from his face. Without answering, he turned the phone over. Seconds later it rang again. He declined the call once more before slipping the phone into his pocket. "Everything all right?" I asked. Nathan forced a reassuring smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "It will be." Before I could ask another question, Oliver suddenly sprinted toward the front door, barking excitedly. A familiar voice echoed from the porch. "Nathan, I really hope you are both home because I accidentally made your story famous, and I do not think either of you is going to enjoy why." Jason stepped into the kitchen carrying a grocery bag in one hand, and an expression that immediately told me whatever had happened was entirely his fault. Oliver happily greeted him anyway, completely convinced that every visitor deserved unconditional forgiveness. Nathan calmly placed 3 mugs on the table before speaking. "Tell us everything." Jason let out a long sigh. I told the story. I frowned. "What story?" "The one about joking that I traded my roommate to my brother for 3 months without housework." Nathan quietly folded his hands together. "How many people?" Jason looked down at the floor. "More than I originally intended." "Which means?" I asked. "The entire office." He gave an awkward smile that disappeared almost instantly. Someone thought it was hilarious and posted the story online. They left out the part where it was obviously a joke. I blinked several times before reaching for the phone Jason handed me. Headlines, comments, and short videos had already transformed an ordinary misunderstanding into a wildly exaggerated story. Complete strangers confidently explained our lives despite never meeting either of us. Some insisted Nathan had rescued me. Others claimed the whole thing had been carefully planned from the beginning. I slowly returned the phone. People really enjoy inventing endings before they know the beginning. Nathan surprised both of us by smiling. "That has always been true." Jason looked genuinely relieved. "You are not angry. Would that solve anything?" Nathan asked calmly. Jason thought about it for a moment before shaking his head. "Not really." "Then we continue living normally." That became exactly what we did. Over the following weeks, the online excitement slowly faded while our ordinary routines quietly continued. Nathan still left fresh coffee waiting every morning. I still walked to the bookstore with Oliver waiting at the front window until I disappeared around the corner. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm, although something subtle had changed. People around us had started making assumptions. At the bookstore, my coworker Emily smiled one afternoon as Nathan arrived carrying an umbrella after an unexpected thunderstorm. "Your partner is thoughtful," she whispered after he left. I almost corrected her, but the words never came. Later that week, the owner of our favorite neighborhood bakery automatically placed 2 cinnamon rolls into one bag before handing them to Nathan. "You and your other half have a wonderful weekend," she said cheerfully. Nathan simply thanked her with his usual polite smile. That evening, while we prepared dinner together, I finally asked the question that had been lingering in my mind. "Why do you never correct anyone?" Nathan looked up from slicing vegetables. "About what?" "People assuming. We are together." He considered the question carefully before answering. "Because they are describing what they see, not what I have told them." "Does it bother you?" He met my eyes without hesitation. "Only if it bothers you." I looked away first because I honestly did not know how to answer. Before either of us could continue, the front doorbell rang. Nathan opened it to find a well-dressed man with sandy blonde hair, kind green eyes, and an easy smile standing on the porch holding 2 takeaway coffees. "Excuse me," the visitor said politely. "Is Liam Brooks here?" I stepped into the hallway. The man's face immediately brightened. "Liam, it really is you. I am Noah Carter. We volunteered together during college. I have been trying to reconnect with old friends from that program." Memories slowly returned. Long charity events, library book drives, and community reading projects. "Noah," I said with a surprised smile. "It has been years." "Too many," he laughed. "I was hoping you might have time for coffee this weekend." Before I could answer, I noticed something unexpected. Nathan's expression remained perfectly calm, but for the first time since we met, I saw a quiet flicker of unmistakable jealousy hidden behind his steady gray eyes, and somehow that single unspoken emotion changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Noah smiled warmly as he handed me one of the coffees. "No pressure," he said. "I simply thought it would be nice to catch up after all these years." Before I could answer, Nathan stepped forward with the same calm politeness he always carried. "Would you like to come inside for a few minutes?" Noah accepted with an appreciative smile, and soon the 4 of us sat around the dining table while Oliver happily rested his head across Noah's knee, apparently deciding he approved of every guest equally. The conversation flowed naturally. Noah reminded me of the community reading events we had organized during college, the afternoons spent delivering books to children's hospitals, and the volunteer weekends that had somehow felt exhausting and rewarding at the same time. I laughed at memories I had almost forgotten, while Nathan listened quietly with genuine interest. Every so often I caught him watching me with a thoughtful expression, as though he was discovering another part of my life that had existed long before we met. After nearly an hour, Noah stood and picked up his jacket. "I should probably let you both enjoy the rest of your evening," he said. Then he looked directly at me. "Would Saturday afternoon work for coffee?" Before I could answer, Nathan spoke for the first time since Noah asked the question. "Liam should decide without feeling rushed." Noah smiled. "Fair enough." He turned back toward me. "Think about it and let me know." After Noah left, the house became unusually quiet. Oliver wandered back to his favorite spot near the fireplace, while Nathan collected the empty coffee cups from the table. I watched him for several moments before asking the question that had been lingering in my mind. "Were you jealous?" Nathan stopped drying one of the mugs and slowly looked up. He considered denying it, then quietly smiled instead. "Yes." His honesty caught me completely off guard. "You admitted that surprisingly fast." "Because pretending otherwise would be unfair." He placed the mug back into the cabinet before continuing. "You are free to spend time with anyone you choose. That has never been my decision to make. But you still felt jealous." "I did." He looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "Feelings and choices are not always the same thing." I found myself smiling despite the seriousness of the conversation. "You know that answer somehow makes you even more confusing." Nathan laughed softly. "Jason tells me the same thing." Saturday arrived with bright blue skies and crisp autumn air. I met Noah at a quiet cafe overlooking the river. We spent hours talking about work, travel, old professors, and the unexpected paths our lives had taken. He was thoughtful, funny, and easy to be around. Yet somewhere in the middle of the conversation, I noticed myself checking my phone almost without thinking. Nathan had sent only one message all afternoon. "Fresh cinnamon rolls are cooling on the kitchen counter. Oliver keeps checking the front door. Drive home safely." I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. Noah noticed immediately. He leaned back in his chair with an amused expression. "Can I make one observation?" "Go ahead." "You have looked at that message 3 times in the last 5 minutes." I laughed quietly. "Have I?" "Yes." He stirred his coffee before speaking again. "I do not think you are waiting to get home because of the cinnamon rolls." I looked at the message once more and slowly slipped the phone back into my pocket. Noah smiled kindly, not with disappointment, but with understanding. Sometimes, he said softly, the place you miss the most is really just another way of describing the person waiting there. His words stayed with me the entire drive home, because somewhere between the quiet house, the handwritten rules, and one man who never tried to control my choices, I realized I had already started calling that place home without ever saying the word out loud. The drive home after meeting Noah felt unusually quiet. The streets looked exactly the same, yet my thoughts refused to settle. Every traffic light seemed to give me another minute to replay his final sentence. Sometimes the place you miss is really just another way of describing the person waiting there. I reached Nathan's house just before sunset. Oliver greeted me at the front door with such excitement that I nearly lost my balance laughing. Nathan was standing in the kitchen exactly as his message had promised, transferring warm cinnamon rolls onto a cooling rack. He looked up with a gentle smile. "Welcome home," he said naturally. The words lingered in the room long after he spoke them. I thanked him for the pastries, and we shared dinner as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. I found myself watching the small habits I had once overlooked. The way he always poured my glass of water before filling his own. The way he quietly moved Oliver's food bowl so nobody would accidentally trip over it. The way he listened without interrupting whenever I talked about my day at the bookstore. Later that evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep beside the fireplace, my phone vibrated with a message from Jason asking if we could meet the following morning, because he had something important to tell me. His unusually serious tone stayed with me throughout the night. The next morning we met at a quiet diner a few blocks from the bookstore. Jason looked exhausted, stirring the same cup of coffee without taking a single sip. "I owe you the truth," he finally said. I waited silently. "Nathan did not invite you to move in because of my joke." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Jason sighed deeply. The joke gave him an opportunity, but it was never the real reason. He looked directly at me before continuing. "Years ago, after our father passed away, Nathan found a handwritten letter among Dad's belongings. Dad wrote about a volunteer from St. Matthew Medical Center who visited every Thursday afternoon to read books to patients who rarely had visitors. He wrote that those afternoons became the brightest part of his treatment. My fingers slowly tightened around my coffee mug. I volunteered there during college." Jason nodded. "Dad remembered your name. Liam Brooks. When I eventually mentioned that my new roommate had the same name, Nathan asked to see a picture. The moment he recognized you, everything changed." I stared at him in complete silence. Every memory from the past several months suddenly shifted into a different shape. The handwritten welcome note, the carefully prepared guest room, the kindness that had always seemed too thoughtful to be accidental. "Why did he never tell me?" I asked quietly. Jason lowered his eyes. "Because he believed that if you knew from the beginning, you might stay out of gratitude instead of because you genuinely wanted to know him." I understood his intention, but another realization hurt even more. He still made the decision for me. Jason nodded slowly. "He knows." I left the diner carrying far more questions than answers. That evening I returned to the house earlier than usual and found Nathan sitting alone on the back porch watching the last light of day disappear beyond the maple trees. Oliver rested peacefully beside him. Nathan looked up as I approached and smiled gently. "You are home early." I stopped a few feet away, my heart suddenly heavier than it had been all day. "Jason told me about your father," I said quietly. Nathan's smile slowly disappeared. He looked toward the garden before closing his eyes for the briefest moment. "Then it is finally time for me to tell you everything." The evening air felt cooler than usual as Nathan and I remained on the back porch, surrounded by the quiet rustle of maple leaves. Oliver rested peacefully between us, unaware that a single conversation was about to change everything. Nathan folded his hands together and stared toward the garden before finally speaking. "My father talked about you until the very end of his life," he said softly. "Not because you did anything extraordinary, but because you treated him like he was more than a patient." I listened without interrupting. He wrote that every Thursday became something to look forward to because a young volunteer would walk through the door carrying books instead of sympathy. I lowered my eyes. "I never knew his family. He wanted it that way," Nathan replied. "He believed kindness meant more when people expected nothing in return." He reached into his pocket and unfolded an old, carefully preserved piece of paper. "This is the letter." He handed it to me with steady hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained clear. I recognized only one line immediately because it mentioned my name. His father had written that if Nathan ever met Liam Brooks again, he hoped he would thank him for giving an old man something to smile about during difficult days. My vision blurred slightly as I finished reading. "You carried this with you?" I asked quietly. Nathan nodded. "For years." "Why did you never tell me?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because gratitude changes relationships. I wanted the chance to know you without placing that weight on your shoulders. But you still decided what I deserved to know." Nathan lowered his head. "I did. You took away my chance to choose from the very beginning." "I know." There was no excuse in his voice, no attempt to defend himself. Only regret. Somehow that honesty made everything hurt even more. I stood and slowly looked around the backyard that had become part of my everyday life. The wooden porch where we drank coffee on Saturday mornings. The garden where Oliver chased squirrels. The kitchen window where warm light always greeted me after work. Every beautiful memory remained real, yet they were now connected to a truth I should have known from the start. "The house rules," I said quietly. "You told me every door in this house should only close behind someone who freely chooses to leave." Nathan looked up. "Yes. I never had complete freedom to choose because I never had the complete story." He closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "You are right." I walked upstairs and opened the guest room that had slowly become my own. Folding my clothes into the suitcase felt strangely unreal. Each item carried a memory. The sweater that still smelled faintly of cinnamon from one of Nathan's baking attempts. The mystery novel we finished together during a thunderstorm. Oliver's worn tennis ball hidden beneath the reading chair. When I carried the suitcase downstairs, Nathan was already standing near the front door. He did not move toward me. He did not ask me to stay. He simply stepped aside, honoring the very rule he had written months earlier. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "I do care about you," I whispered. Nathan's eyes softened. "I know. That is exactly why I have to leave." He nodded once. "Then leave because it is your choice, not because you think I expect it." I opened the door and stepped into the cool autumn evening. Behind me, the house remained quiet. Nathan never called my name. He never asked me to turn around. For the first time since our paths crossed, every decision truly belonged to me. And although walking away broke my heart, I knew I needed to discover whether love built on hidden truths could become strong enough to survive complete honesty. Returning to the old apartment should have felt familiar, yet every corner reminded me that something inside me had quietly changed. Jason welcomed me back with genuine concern, but even he seemed surprised by how quickly I slipped into habits I had never practiced before. I folded blankets after using them. I washed dishes immediately instead of leaving them overnight. Every evening, I instinctively brewed enough tea for two before realizing there was only one mug waiting on the table. Jason noticed everything. One night, he watched me place an extra plate beside my own before quietly putting it back into the cabinet without saying a word. "You miss him," he finally said. I looked toward the kitchen window where rain softly tapped against the glass. "I miss the life we built," I answered honestly. "Do you regret leaving?" I thought about the question for a long moment before shaking my head. No. I needed to know that if I ever returned, it would be because I chose it freely. Jason smiled sadly. He understood that before I did. Across town, Nathan was discovering that an empty house could somehow feel louder than a crowded one. Every morning, he still prepared 2 cups of coffee before remembering there was only one person left to drink it. Every evening, he paused outside the neighborhood bookstore on his drive home out of habit before quietly continuing toward the house alone. Oliver refused to sleep beside the fireplace and instead curled up outside the guest room every night, staring at the closed door as though waiting for footsteps that never came. Nathan never moved a single thing from the room. The welcome card remained on the desk. The reading lamp stayed beside the chair. Even the bookshelf still held the space where my favorite novels had once rested. Weeks passed as autumn slowly painted the city in deeper shades of gold and crimson. I buried myself in work at the bookstore, convincing myself that routine would eventually silence the ache I carried. It never did. Emily noticed long before I admitted anything aloud. One afternoon, she placed a newly arrived novel on the checkout counter beside me. The title read, "Home is where we choose to stay." I laughed quietly at the coincidence. "You think books always know the answer?" I asked. She smiled. Sometimes they simply remind us of what we already know. That Saturday, Jason convinced me to visit the neighborhood farmer's market, insisting fresh air would do us both good. We wandered between flower stands, local bakeries, and handmade crafts, while musicians played soft acoustic songs near the entrance. I had almost convinced myself it was becoming a pleasant afternoon when Oliver suddenly came running toward me through the crowd with unmistakable excitement. Before I even stood up completely, he was happily circling my legs with his favorite tennis ball clenched proudly between his teeth. I looked up to find Nathan walking toward us carrying a small bouquet of white daisies. He stopped several feet away, allowing the silence to settle naturally between us. "He still checks the guest room every night," Nathan said softly while looking down at Oliver. I swallowed the sudden tightness in my throat. "I still wake up expecting to smell fresh coffee every morning." Nathan smiled with quiet understanding. He gently held out the bouquet. "These reminded me of something you once said. You told me ordinary days become memorable because of simple kindness." I accepted the flowers carefully. "You remembered." "I remember almost everything." He took one respectful step backward instead of closer. "You do not owe me an answer today, Liam. I only wanted you to know that I have not stopped respecting your choice." As he turned to leave, I looked at the white daisies resting in my hands and finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. I no longer missed a beautiful house, peaceful routines, or quiet mornings. I missed the one person who had made every ordinary moment feel like coming home. 3 days passed after the farmer's market, yet the bouquet of white daisies remained fresh on the windowsill beside my bed. Every morning before leaving for work, I paused for a moment to look at them, remembering not only Nathan's words but the quiet respect he had shown by never asking me to return. He had given me exactly what I once believed I had lost: the freedom to choose. On the 4th morning, I woke before sunrise with a strange sense of certainty that felt calmer than excitement and stronger than doubt. I reached into my desk drawer and found the small brass key Nathan had given me on the day I moved into his house. Somehow, during all the confusion of leaving, I had forgotten it was still in my coat pocket. I slipped it into my jacket and quietly walked toward the front door. Jason looked up from the kitchen, where he was unsuccessfully attempting to make pancakes. "You look different today," he said. I smiled. "I finally know where I am going." "Work?" he asked hopefully. I laughed. "Home." Jason never asked another question. He simply smiled, wished me luck, and watched me leave. When I reached Nathan's house, Oliver spotted me through the front window before I even knocked. The front door swung open moments later, and the joyful golden retriever rushed outside with so much excitement that I nearly lost my balance laughing. Nathan appeared behind him, completely frozen for a second when he realized who was standing on the porch. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt peaceful, as though both of us finally understood what the other had been trying to protect all along. I reached into my jacket pocket and held up the brass key. "I think I forgot to return something," I said with a small smile. Nathan looked at the key before quietly shaking his head. "No," he answered. "You kept exactly what I hoped you would." I stepped a little closer. "When I left, I thought I was walking away because of what you hid from me. But after living without you, I realized something much more important. Every dinner we shared, every Saturday morning, every conversation, every ordinary day we spent together was real. None of that disappeared because one decision at the beginning was wrong." Nathan's eyes softened with unmistakable relief. "I never wanted my father's gratitude to become the reason you stayed. It will not be." I gently placed the brass key into his hand before closing his fingers around it. "The reason I came back is much simpler." He looked at me with quiet hope. "Tell me." I smiled. "Because this time I chose you with the whole truth." Nathan closed his eyes for the briefest moment before letting out a slow breath that sounded almost like years of worry finally disappearing. He walked to the small hallway table, picked up the folded page containing the house rules, and looked at it one last time. Then, without hesitation, he tore it into small pieces and dropped them into the recycling bin. "No more rules," he said softly. "No more hidden reasons. No more decisions made for you." I nodded. "Only honesty." "Only honesty," he repeated. Oliver happily dropped his tennis ball between us, as though insisting life should not become too serious for long. We both laughed, and somehow that simple shared laughter felt like the truest beginning of all. Nathan reached out his hand, not asking me to stay because he needed me, but inviting me to walk beside him because he respected my freedom. I slipped my hand into his without hesitation. Looking back now, people still ask whether our story really began with an unbelievable joke about 3 months of housework. I always smile because they never expect the real answer. The joke only opened the front door. Love began much later, on the day two imperfect people finally trusted each other enough to choose the same future, freely, honestly, and together.